In the previous video, we looked at an overview of the gold standard and how the world moved from the gold standard into using the US dollar as a standard for exchange rate in the exchange rate markets and system. In this video and in the upcoming few videos, I'll go through various arguments for flexible exchange rates and arguments against flexible exchange rates. One thing to keep in mind, whatever arguments we have for flexible exchange rate are essentially the arguments against fixed or pegged exchange rate. And whatever arguments we have for pegged and fixed exchange rate are essentially the arguments against flexible exchange rate. One thing that we know and one thing the world adopts, as you can see from this statistic, is that most countries, generally speaking, have a managed float. See, I can use different color. Most countries generally have a managed float or some sort of a mixture of both, in the sense that if this is fixed exchange rate and we have free exchange rate or flexible exchange rate, essentially most countries are somewhere in the middle, where they adopt some policies of fixed and some policies of pegged or flexible exchange rate, so that they have a balance between them. Essentially the sweet spot is between both the exchange rates. So the first argument for having a flexible exchange rate is so that it allows government independence to use their policies, monetary or fiscal policy, to focus on domestic issues rather than try to focus on international issues. If we are in a fixed exchange rate, we have to make sure that our we have to make sure that the external balance is equal to zero. In other words, that we don't have a financial account surplus, or we don't have a balance of payment deficit or a surplus. We prefer everything to cancel each other out if we are talking about a fixed exchange rate. In a flexible exchange rate, we don't really care about what's happening to the external market, in the sense that we don't really care about whether we have a balance of payment surplus or whether we have a balance of payment deficit. Let's say that in this example, this point over here, let's just call that point A. Point A is the equilibrium point where we have a trade balance, where the trade balance cancels out, where the net where the net imports and net exports cancel out, where the net imports and exports are equal to zero. A point where net exports and net imports are essentially zero. That position we would call that a trade balance. Let's say that position is point A. However, we know that in the economy, total income is derived from consumption plus investment plus government spending minus taxation plus net exports. So net exports are not the only function that helps us understand or determine the national income in the economy. We also have other three factors. So we have no reason to believe that if point A is the trade balance equilibrium, the economy would be functioning at that point. Maybe the economy is functioning somewhere over here. Maybe the economy is functioning, let's say, somewhere at point B. And if there is a situation, it could be forward, it could also be backward. Maybe the economy is somewhere over here. Let's call this point C, and it's called point Y1. Maybe the economy is actually functioning below the trade equilibrium, or maybe the economy is functioning and maybe the economy is functioning beyond the trade equilibrium. We do not know for certain, because we also have these other three functions. Most often than not, the economy is not equal to the trade equilibrium point in the national income. So let's say that for some reason the economy is working at Y0, and if that is the case, you will notice from the graph that we have a current account deficit. And if we have a current account deficit in a fixed exchange rate, the government would have to implement restrictive monetary or fiscal policies. The government would have to implement monetary or fiscal policy to restrict aggregate demand, to reduce aggregate demand, which would essentially bring our Y0 back to YTB. So it will bring Y0 back to YTB, which is essentially the point where the trade balance equals out, a point where trade balance equals out, and the economy would function as on an equilibrium point. The problem is, whenever the government implements monetary or fiscal policy, whether that be restrictive or expansion, it doesn't really matter. Whenever the government implements monetary or fiscal policies, we will always have consequences not just on the external market but also on the domestic market. Maybe that would impact unemployment. Maybe monetary or fiscal policy could impact employment. Let's write that down. Maybe the monetary or fiscal policy could affect employment. Who knows? Maybe it could impact inflation. Who knows? The point is, whenever the government tries to interfere in the external balance or try to interfere to make sure the trade balance cancels out by intervening into the market using monetary or fiscal policies, it is definitely going to impact some domestic issues such as employment, such as inflation. It could also be GDP in many cases, and therefore having a flexible exchange rate, the government does not have to worry about the external balance. The government can only think about the internal balance, or can only focus on domestic issues, and all the policies can be directed towards domestic issues, and we don't really have to we don't really have to worry about the external balance. Now, this makes sense intuitively, but in reality, we know that external balance also has a very important role in determining GDP. So we cannot completely ignore the external balance either. This is why most countries, as I said, try to adopt a more balanced approach where they adopt some policies of fixed, some policies of exchange. In most real life economies, governments try to keep a managed float, which essentially means that they allow the external balance to deviate from zero a little bit, but they don't allow it to deviate a lot, because that is going to impact the exports and imports of the economy. But for the sake of argument, we are just trying to understand the two extremes. So in this situation, the argument for flexible exchange rate is that if the government intervenes in the external exchange rate market by either expansionary or restrictive monetary or fiscal policies to bring the economy back into equilibrium, a balance of payment equilibrium, it is going to have consequence on the domestic market, employment, inflation, etc., etc. And for that reason, the government should not have a fixed exchange rate. The government should have a flexible exchange rate. Another argument that we have has to deal with capital inflows and capital outflows, or in some textbooks they use hot money inflows, hot money outflows, essentially mean the same thing. Before we talk about how the exchange rate can affect net imports and how the exchange rate can affect inflows and outflows, let's try to understand what does capital inflow and outflow actually mean. So what does net capital outflow? An acronym for net capital outflow is NCO. So we know that income is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending minus taxation minus net exports. Net exports essentially is exports minus imports. If I rearrange this equation, if I were to rearrange this equation to make my net exports the subject, we would essentially have sorry, we have to add net exports, my bad. We would essentially have national income minus consumption minus investment, minus government spending is equal to net exports minus net exports plus, keep on writing, plus investment. We know from our basic macroeconomic identities, which if you do not know, just don't worry about it. Just understand that national income minus consumption minus government spending is essentially the same thing as national savings. So another way of looking at this is by saying that national savings minus investment is equal to net exports. Let's assume that in this simplistic economy, the total net savings in the economy is, let's say, $10. And let's say that I'm spending from that $10 $5 in domestic investment. I want to invest in some property, so I spend $5 investing in that property. Well, what would I do with that other remaining $5? What would I do with that extra $5? The only rational argument is that we would use that $5 to invest in countries abroad, to invest in some other property abroad, or some other investment or some other asset abroad, and we would call this as net capital outflow. The money is flowing from the economy towards the outside. We would call that net capital outflow. So we can say that net capital outflow is equal to net exports. And we can look at it the other way around, net capital inflow. So inflow of capital, money coming into the economy, is equal to negative net export, which is essentially the same thing as imports, meaning we have more imports. So a simplistic way, I guess a simplistic way of looking at net outflows and inflows Whenever we have more exports, than import, generally we have a capital outflow. And whenever we have imports more than exports, generally we have a net inflow. Yes, there are lots of conditions attached to this which is beyond the scope of this class, but for simplicity, let's just keep in but for simplicity, just keep in mind, whenever we have more exports, we have outflow. Whenever we have more imports, we have inflow. Well, what does that have to do anything with our exchange rate system? We have to keep in mind, in a fixed exchange rate system, we want to make sure that our external balance, is equal to zero, which would mean that we are trying to make sure that whatever capital we are getting from net inflows and outflows is equal to zero. So the government would again have to intervene using expansionary or contractionary fiscal and monetary policy in order to bring it back to zero. And as you can see, if the government does that, we are going to directly impact our net. So we are directly going to impact our net exports, and as you can see, if the government tries to intervene and tries to make sure that the capital that we are gaining from exports and imports cancels out and equals out, you can see that is directly going to impact net outflow of money and net inflow of money. Now, whether that is a positive or negative, whether that is beneficial or harmful for the economy is besides the topic, but for sure we know that that is going to impact outflows and inflows of currency, and that can be a problem for a government, especially if it's a developing economy. Developing economies want inflows. Developing economies want money to come into the market, money to come into the country, so they can actually have more investments in the economy. The point is, by keeping a fixed exchange rate, we are going to have problems with inflows and outflows, and it goes back with the same argument that we made for the previous point. If we have restrictive or contractionary or expansionary monetary or fiscal policy, we are going to directly have problems with the domestic goals. Domestic goal in this situation could be to have more investments into the economy. So by having a flexible exchange rate, we can ensure that we have more investment coming into the economy. And by having a fixed exchange rate, the argument is that the inflows or outflows are affected, and therefore domestic goals in the economy could be affected. The third point we used in order to make an argument for flexible exchange rate is that it allows the economy to live through economic shocks. Let's say that the current economic shock we are facing through, as I'm recording this video, is COVID-19, and we know that because of COVID-19, especially the hotel or the hoteling industry has taken a huge hit. And if we were using a flexible exchange rate, this allows the market to adjust without having severe consequences. If I can draw a supply and demand of a currency, let's say we have US dollar against let's say we have yuan. So we've got yuan, and let's say for some reason, due to economic shocks, the supply for dollars have decreased. So now we have a new equilibrium. If the initial equilibrium point was A, our new equilibrium point could be B. In this situation, we can see that the dollar has appreciated. Now, it doesn't really matter whether dollar is appreciating or depreciating, whether currency is appreciating or depreciating. That's besides the point. The point is, whenever we have an economic shock in a flexible exchange rate, the market can re-equilibrate itself and come back to an equilibrium position that can work for the exchange rate. But if this was a fixed exchange rate, the government would have to again intervene into the market to make sure that we have a fixed exchange rate of point A, and we don't have any fluctuation in the exchange market. And the government could obviously try to do that using expansionary or restrictive monetary or fiscal policy, which again goes back to our same argument that we made earlier, that would have a direct impact on the domestic policies of the country. So to summarize it again, all the points which are for flexible exchange rate essentially hover around, we have to zoom that out. All the policies for flexible exchange rate essentially hover around the same argument, which has to do with domestic policies, domestic goals, or we can say external goals, internal balance or external balance, or domestic goals or external goals. If a country asks for a more flexible exchange rate, the policies become more independent, meaning all the policies, they just have to worry about the domestic market. They don't really care about the external markets because the government is not trying to make sure that the external balance equals out. So they can just focus on the domestic market. And the argument is that if we implement contractionary or expansionary monetary or fiscal policies via effort to make sure that the external balance equals out, you are going to affect domestic market, and that is in the long term going to have more negative consequences than having any positive consequences. As you will see in the next video, that even though flexible exchange rate might sound great, there are some arguments, solid arguments against flexible exchange rate, and as a result, most governments around the world usually adopt for a way between them, which is a managed float, which is essentially a mixture of both flexible and fixed exchange rate. So hopefully this video gives us a brief understanding of the arguments for flexible exchange rate and why the government might want to have flexible exchange